President Lee Jae Myung is home this week following his presence at this year's NATO summit in Turkey, as well as a state visit to Mongolia. And in both places, he touched upon the importance of peace on the Korean peninsula and more. Hope your work week is off to a good start. It's Monday, July 13th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. 2 countries and 1 week of summit diplomacy amid a fresh push to elevate South Korea's global profile. Now, this was the gist of President Lee Jae Myung's mission to Turkey and Mongolia last week. For more on this, I have Chloe Borgnon with French broadcaster France 24 here in the studio. Chloe, welcome back.
Hello, thank you for having me.
I also have Professor Ban Kil Joo at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy live on the line. Professor Ban, as always, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Pleased to be with you.
Chloe, let's start here in the studio. Let's begin with details of President Lee Jae Myung's state visit to Mongolia and the diplomatic gains of that particular trip.
Yeah, so first, it's interesting to note that it was the first visit from the Korean president in Mongolia in 15 years. So it was a 3-day visit, including state summit with the Mongolian president. He also met with the Speaker of Parliament. He also met with the Prime Minister. So quite a busy visit, actually. So what we know is when meeting with the Mongolian president, they both declared that it was the start of a golden era in the relationship, bilateral relationship between the 2 countries. They were speaking about cooperation. So he also had a lunch meeting with the South Korean community where Lee Jae Myung has been comparing the South Korean pioneering spirit with the Mongolia's nomadic spirit, explaining that's maybe one of the reasons why the 2 countries can understand each other so well, and that the friendship is there. He did call Mongolia a close friend. That was on the state dinner Friday evening. And he also talked at that moment about expanding the bilateral collaboration. So the effect could be felt, especially by citizens on both sides. So not only diplomatically or to a state level, but also having real effects on both countries' citizens. The things more they've been talking about is mostly cooperation in supply chains, cooperation in critical minerals, for example, to get them. There was a memorandum of understanding that was signed in 2023. The discussions are to kind of update this one, especially, obviously, critical materials are very useful for semiconductors, for chips, for everything around AI, around digital era. So Korea has been trying quite a lot to get some other way to get those critical minerals and materials. So that's obviously a very important part. And there's been also discussion in a lot of different economic and cultural areas. So for example, developing transport infrastructures, also food export, the Korean food, K-food export, even if it's more on a private business level, obviously. But with the president on Friday dinner, for example, there was economic leaders from South Korean teams. There were about 40 people, like 40 companies there. So that was part of also of discussion. And the main thing was the idea of principle, like agreement on principle on a comprehensive economic partnership agreement that would be, they would work together to reach around 2030 about $1 billion in annual bilateral trade. So that's kind of a very big promise.
Right, indeed. Professor Ban, I wonder, why are Seoul's ties with Ulaanbaatar important, keeping in mind, of course, the current state of geopolitics?
Well, South Korea and Mongolia ties matter geopolitically and diplomatically. First, reciprocal profits through the cooperation of critical minerals are possible because Mongolia is rich in critical minerals, and South Korea is equipped with the state-of-the-art technologies to explore and develop them. This reciprocal architecture is greatly advantageous in a situation where critical mineral security is at the forefront these days under the transitional and unpredictable international order. Second, South Korea and Mongolia ties could create diplomatic synergy because South Korea's diplomatic strategy is harmonized with Mongolia's one, actually, in some sense. South Korea seeks inclusive diplomacy with non-like-minded countries, as well as security diplomacy with allies and partners. Meanwhile, Mongolia takes its diplomatic ties with South Korea seriously, but at the same time, it is close diplomatically to China, Russia, and North Korea. In this sense, Mongolia's diplomatic flexibility is harmonized with South Korea's inclusive diplomacy. In particular, Mongolia could play a positive role in supporting South Korea policy on North Korea and mitigating tension on the Korean Peninsula if it takes advantage of its unique diplomacy. Third, under the architecture of diplomatic pragmatism, the ROC government also seeks expanded diplomacy, where it expands its diplomatic horizon. To this end, South Korea is aiming for the new Northern Policy 2.0 and the new Southern Policy 2.0. Meanwhile, Mongolia serves as an important arena to achieve the objectives of the new Northern Policy 2.0 because of its geopolitical location as one of the Central Asian countries. All in all, the golden era of the ROC-Mongolia relationship reflects all this geopolitical and diplomatic importance. The fact that the South Korean president visited Mongolia in the second year of his administration, which is an initial phase, shows how important Mongolia is to South Korea geopolitically and diplomatically.
Right. And speaking about North Korea, Chloe, President Lee Jae Myung and his Mongolian counterpart, Ukhnaagiin Khürelsükh, did touch upon tensions on the Korean Peninsula. Could you tell us a bit more about what was said? Yeah,
so what we know is Lee Jae Myung, after the meeting with the president of Mongolia, said that he gave him his vision for peace and stability here on the Korean Peninsula, and that the Mongolian president strongly agreed with those principles. And then later we got some more information given by the presidential office. They said that the two leaders agreed to strengthen cooperation in effort to establish peace on the Korean Peninsula and to reaffirm that they wanted to ensure peace on the broader region as well that would benefit both countries. So that's always interesting to know that Mongolia is feeling like they also have a need for themselves to see peace and stability in the area. And then the Mongolian president also said that he pledged his proactive support to Seoul peace-building effort, and maybe most importantly, he also pledged the role in resumption of inter-Korean dialogue if possible.
Right, and speaking about inter-Korean dialogue, I'd like to circle back to something you mentioned, Professor Ban. Do you believe Mongolia can indeed play a part in promoting dialogue between the two Koreas?
Well, it's not going to be easy, but any role could be helpful in a situation where extreme hostility continues on the Korean Peninsula. When countries break up all communications and diplomatic engagements, a mediating role is more important. The Iran war showed how important mediators are to initiate the communication and negotiating process. In this sense, Mongolia could serve as an optimal mediator due to these unique ties with North Korea. Mongolia has an embassy in North Korea, and reciprocally, North Korea has an embassy in Mongolia. So Mongolia and North Korea talk to each other frequently. This unique position allows Mongolia to play a mediating role in initiating inter-Korean talks, which has been developed over the last several years. In short, Mongolia's unique position is taken as an asset for a mediating actor. The remaining question is how willing Mongolia is to play this role. If tension on the Korean Peninsula were to be mitigated, the ROC-Mongolia economic cooperation could be much more facilitating. So a mediating role could be aligned with Mongolia's national interests as well. With this in mind, I would say that the ROC-Mongolia summit could pave the way for stepping up Mongolia's willingness to play a mediating role in easing tension on the Korean Peninsula.
Right, I see. Now, Chloe, prior to his state visit to Mongolia, President Lee Jae Myung was in Turkey to attend the NATO summit. Could you walk us through his agenda there?
Yeah, so he was there on Tuesday and Wednesday. So the first day he was meeting with the NATO Secretary General to start negotiation on a South Korea and NATO procurement framework agreement. So this is supposed to be a structured long-term contracts where you have prices and volumes that are kind of set up in advance to allow some exchange, and especially for all the NATO countries to be able to buy from South Korea. And the same day there was also the NATO Summit Defense Industry Forum. That's where this whole framework was the most important, because the whole idea would be to be able to elevate the South Korea and NATO defense framework. South Korea is not at the moment part of NATO. So there was this idea of being able to get this better framework that will also allow South Korea to be able to promote the defense industry a bit more. And there was also been having a lot of bilateral meetings actually on the side of the NATO summits. So for example, with the Romanian president on Wednesday, with the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky as well, where he has pledged about $100 million worth of non-lethal assistance to Ukraine. They've also been speaking about the prisoners of war, the North Korean prisoners of war, or in Ukraine at the moment, and also met with the Canadian Prime Minister among the deal about submarines at that moment, among others.
Right, and with regard to sideline summits, Professor Ban, President Lee Jae Myung also spoke separately to US President Donald Trump about warship building, I understand. But before I ask you that question, I'd first like your thoughts, or your assessment that is, of the Lee Jae Myung administration's gains, achievements, agenda at the NATO summit this year.
To be honest, actually, since President Lee did not attend last year's NATO summit, South Korea's diplomatic stance towards Europe and NATO remained unclear. Attendance at this year's NATO summit helped address this ambiguity. Furthermore, his agendas and messages were well suited for maximizing South Korea's national interest based upon pragmatic the diplomacy. To be more specific, first of all, attendance at this year's NATO summit helped consolidate South Korea's diplomacy with Europe and its status under the IPO platform. In particular, President Lee delivered the keynote address at the NATO Summit Defense Industry Forum, where the concept of common values served as a key theme. In addition, this meeting encouraged South Korea to play an enhanced role in the NATO IP4 communication. Second, the sharing of common values between South Korea and Europe encouraged South Korea to be much more cooperative with Europe regarding the K defense industry in an effort to make the long-standing defense cooperation work. In particular, South Korea suggested the ROC NATO Defense Industry Partnership 2.0 to the NATO members. I would say that this suggestion was intended for South Korea's defense industry to be embedded in European defense industry markets from a long-term perspective in a situation where Buy European is being emphasized these days. In this regard, South Korea's agenda on K defense industry is timely and strategically optimal. Third, the K defense industry as an agenda was also helpful for the alliance risk management and the alliance cohesion between South Korea and the United States. On the sidelines of this summit, as you pointed out earlier, President Lee met US President Trump in a situation where Trump had earlier asked to him whether South Korea is able to build around 10 naval ships for the United States. So they talk about shipbuilding cooperation. To sum it up, this summit was helpful in terms of diplomacy, K defense industry, and the ROC-US alliance.
Right, indeed. Now, as Professor Ban has mentioned, Chloe, on the sidelines of the NATO summit, President Lee Jae Myung met with Donald Trump to talk about warship building. Could you tell us exactly what was exchanged between these two leaders?
Yeah, so there's been, in the bilateral discussion, a follow-up discussion on the United States shipbuildings by South Korean firms. So it's a senior Blue House official who explained that there's been this discussion and that Donald Trump seems to appear to not have ruled out the possibility of allowing South Korean shipbuilders to be building the Navy, the US Navy ships, even if they say that you saw that the wording that I quoted was really careful because they said that there was quite a fragmented discussion that obviously was bilateral on the side discussion, so nothing is set yet. But they say that it would be interesting to see if it happens because that would, at first the idea was to have a transfer of the Korean technology towards the United States because there's a rule in the law for now saying that anything related to the Navy, the Army, Navy of the United States have to be done by US firms because the secrets, obviously defense secrets have to be carefully protected. So the idea that it could be built in South Korea is interesting because that could put an end to this very exceptional way of doing it with the US Navy. And we know that there's been request for information that has been officially issued by the US Navy towards the biggest shipbuilders in Korea, asking them their capacities to build the American destroyers and fleet tankers. So that means that there's already been some question asked us of what they could build, how much they could build, how fast they could do it. And it's a movement that's going maybe towards South Korean sides more because that's going along the agreement that was reached on the side of the APEC summit in October, the Make American Shipbuilding Great Again, the MASGA initiative, because it's supposed to be Korea's pledge $350 billion to be invested in shipbuilding in general, not just the army, but shipbuilding in general. And that was including $150 billion that were committed for commercial shipbuilding sector from Korea under a joint financial network. And that's also why a lot of the Korean shipbuilders have been actually promoting and actively working towards having shipyards in the United States to be able to go through that MASGA initiative.
All right then, against this backdrop, Professor Ban, there is much talk about what South Korean shipbuilding has to offer to the US and how such a partnership should be structured. What are your thoughts?
Well, South Korean shipbuilding greatly helped the US alliance survive in this era of faltering alliances, although some hurdles still remain regarding legal obstacles like the Jones Act. Well, the Trump administration has converted the gravity of an alliance formula from shared threats to reciprocal profits. Meanwhile, South Korea's world-class shipbuilding capability allowed the United States to acknowledge South Korea as an ally that can help the United States substantially. In more detail, the formula of reciprocal profits were able to be applied to the evolution of the US alliance. In particular, South Korean shipbuilding capacity is expected to contribute to the United States in the two major objectives. First, military readiness in the Western Pacific for the US Navy, and second, reviving American shipbuilding infrastructure. South Korea's professional capacity in MRO, maintenance, repair, and overhaul can help the US naval ships continue their show force in the Western Pacific. And shipbuilding cooperation between South Korea and the United States can provide the United States with an opportunity to revive its shipbuilding industry. These two expected utilities made the MASGA project to be at the forefront of the US alliance. In fact, the MASGA project contributed to the successful design of the modernizing alliance between South Korea and the United States, which was made last year. So all in all, I would say that shipbuilding cooperation is not only reciprocally profitable, but also greatly helpful for the evolution of the US alliance towards the symmetric mechanism. So this MASGA-based project will be structured as we expected, actually. But one thing is enough, actually. Bipartisan support is necessary for this project to continue to go on.
Right, indeed. Bipartisan support for that particular partnership. We have some time left, Chloe, so let's quickly touch upon renewed military hostilities between the US and Iran. What is the latest on that front?
Yeah, so this weekend has been quite intense in movement. So there's been new United States strikes on Iran this weekend. So Saturday, they attacked in retaliation to an attack by Iran on a Cyprus ship in the Strait of Hormuz, according to the Pentagon. Iran is saying that the ship was struck for traveling an unauthorized route through the Strait of Hormuz, because we know that it's kind of the main tension point still now, even if traffic is still starting again. This is a bit of the question at the moment. Is the strait open? So Iran and the US are saying completely opposite things all weekend. We still don't really know how it's looking for now. Donald Trump, the president, was called, and he was on a phone interview with Reuters on Sunday, and he told them, and I'm quoting him, "We are beating them up." in this interview. And in answer, Iran has also been targeting U.S. allies that's around the countries that are around it. So Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Jordan, Oman have been struck. And it's very, very tense, actually, even in the words and the exchange that happen, even if they're not talking to each other directly. But Donald Trump have threatened to decimate and destroy Iran if the regime made an attempt on his life. The Iran supreme leader vowed to avenge his father's death. So yeah, it's all still very ongoing, while negotiations are still supposed to be happening. Saturday, the Iranian delegation still went in Oman for the negotiation via mediators to try and get the Strait of Hormuz open and get the ceasefire stabilized.
Right, and given this situation, Professor Ban, I wonder, this may be a very tough question, but what endgames do you envision for this conflict between Mr. Trump and Tehran?
Well, even Washington and Tehran might not have answers on the outlook of the endgame because it is becoming much more unpredictable as time goes by. In fact, as you are well aware, the United States and Iran continue military strikes despite the agreed MOU. In the meantime, it seems to be clear that neither wants to resume a full-scale war because resuming a war could lead to a lose-lose game. With this in mind, we could come up with three possible scenarios. The first scenario is that the United States and Iran return to the negotiating table after a few more strikes. Under this scenario, the MOU could still be functional, although they stopped negotiating temporarily. The second scenario is that they neutralize the MOU itself and bolster their level of military strikes, but their military strikes do not cross the threshold towards resuming war. Third scenario is that they break the MOU and they engage a war under a totally different name. I would say that the first scenario is most likely, and the third scenario is least likely because neither wants a long-lasting war, as I mentioned earlier. What might happen is that under the first scenario, they could be entrapped in a dilemma where neither negotiation nor war is made. So the long-standing armistice without a peace deal or a war termination could turn out to be the end game. What worries me is that if this scenario were to take place, indeed, the Strait of Hormuz could come under the strong control of Iran, and then Tehran could continue a nuclear program while taking advantage of the long-standing armistice. So the international community needs to pay more attention to prevent this worst-case scenario from taking place.
Right, of course, the worst-case scenario being a wider regional war between the two countries. I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Professor Ban, as always, thank you so much for your insights today.
Thanks for having me.
Chloe here in the studio, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Right, that ends Monday's edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching. Be sure to join us again same time tomorrow as we touch upon tourism trends.